In the autumn of 1995, in a small town where everyone knew each other, a young girl suddenly vanished. A family's life changed forever, and police found no evidence. But 27 years later, a hidden clue came to light. It uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Now, let's get into today's missing person case. Fairview, Ohio, was the kind of place you drove through without really noticing. It was a small, working-class town surrounded by miles of empty cornfields and dense patches of woods. There was a main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a single movie theater that only showed one film at a time. But more than anything else, Fairview was a football town. In the mid-90s, high school football wasn't just a game in a place like Fairview. It was a religion. Every Friday night in the fall, the entire town would shut down. Store owners flipped their signs to closed, families bundled up in heavy jackets, and everyone made the slow walk to the high school stadium. The stadium lights were the brightest thing for miles, casting a yellow glow that you could see from the highway. For the class of 1996, this particular autumn was supposed to be the best time of their lives. Cassette tapes were still playing in car stereos. Nobody had a cell phone, and the biggest worry most teenagers had was passing their finals or getting a date to the dance. It was a simpler time. A time when you could tell your parents you were going to a friend's house, and they wouldn't expect to hear from you until the streetlights came on. At the absolute center of this world was Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was 17 years old, and she was the girl everyone wanted to be. She had bright blonde hair, an infectious laugh, and a smile that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. She was a cheerleader, an honor roll student, and the undisputed sweetheart of Fairview High. But she wasn't just popular. She was genuinely kind. If a freshman dropped their books in the hallway, Sarah was the one kneeling down to help them pick up the papers. If someone was sitting alone in the cafeteria, Sarah would pull up a chair. Her best friend, Emily, knew her better than anyone. They had been inseparable since kindergarten, growing up on the same street, sharing secrets on summer nights, and dreaming about the day they would finally graduate and leave Fairview behind. Emily was the quiet one, the observer. She was the anchor to Sarah's bright, floating balloon. To the rest of the town, Sarah's life looked perfect. But Emily knew the truth. She knew about the heavy, suffocating pressure that Sarah lived under every single day. Sarah's parents, Arthur and Helen Jenkins, were prominent figures in the community. Arthur owned the largest car dealership in the county, and Helen was the president of the PTA. They lived in a massive, pristine house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The house always felt more like a museum than a home. The white carpets were spotless, the furniture was perfectly arranged, and there was absolutely no room for mistakes. The Jenkins family was obsessed with image. Arthur expected his daughter to be flawless. He had already planned out her entire future. She was going to be the valedictorian, she was going to attend his alma mater, and she was going to marry someone from a respectable family. Sarah never argued with them. She just nodded, smiled, and did exactly what she was told. But Emily could see the toll it was taking. She could see Sarah biting her nails down to the quick. She could see the way Sarah constantly twisted the silver ring on her right hand whenever her father spoke to her. As the middle of October rolled around, the town was buzzing with excitement. It was homecoming week, the biggest event of the year. The Fairview Falcons were undefeated, and Friday night's game against their rival, Oak Creek, was all anyone could talk about. But as the week progressed, Emily began to notice a shift in her best friend. It started on a Tuesday, right after the morning pep rally. The gymnasium had been deafening, filled with the sounds of the marching band and hundreds of screaming students. After the rally ended, Emily found Sarah standing by her locker. Sarah looked pale. Her hands were shaking as she tried to dial the combination on her lock. She kept messing it up, spinning the dial over and over again with a look of pure panic in her eyes. Emily gently touched her shoulder, asking if she was okay. Sarah jumped, startled, before forcing a weak smile. She told Emily she was just tired. She said the stress of college applications and the upcoming homecoming court was giving her a headache. Emily accepted the answer, but it didn't sit right with her. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. On Thursday night, the two girls were sitting on Emily's bedroom floor, using thick markers to make spirit posters for the game. The radio was playing softly in the background. For a long time, the room was quiet. Sarah was staring blankly out the window into the dark street, the cap of a black marker still clutched in her hand. Suddenly, without looking at Emily, Sarah spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wish you could just get in a car, drive away, and never look back? Just disappear, and let everyone think whatever they want?" Emily chuckled, thinking it was just a joke about senioritis. She agreed, saying she couldn't wait to escape Fairview and move to a big city. But Sarah didn't laugh. She just kept staring out the window, her expression completely unreadable. Something felt wrong, really wrong, but Emily brushed it off. They were 17. Everyone felt overwhelmed sometimes. Then came Friday, October 20, 1995. The air was bitterly cold that evening. The kind of sharp autumn cold that bites at your cheeks and makes you wish you had brought a thicker scarf. The stadium was packed. The metal bleachers were overflowing with people huddled under thick blankets, clutching paper cups of steaming hot chocolate. The smell of roasted peanuts and dry leaves hung thick in the air. Sarah was down on the track with the other cheerleaders, moving through the routines. From up in the stands, Emily watched her. Sarah looked beautiful in her uniform, but something was missing. The usual spark in her eye was gone. She was going through the motions, perfectly hitting every mark, but her mind seemed to be a million miles away. When halftime arrived, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the announcement of the homecoming queen. The stadium announcer's voice echoed through the crackling speakers. The candidates walked down the center of the football field, escorted by their fathers. Arthur Jenkins walked proudly beside his daughter, wearing a heavy wool coat, waving to the people he knew in the stands. Sarah was wearing her formal dress now, a stunning, deep blue gown that shimmered under the harsh stadium lights. She looked like a movie star. When the announcer called Sarah's name as the winner, the crowd erupted into cheers. The marching band played a triumphant song. A sparkling silver tiara was placed on Sarah's head, and a large bouquet of roses was handed to her. She smiled and waved. The camera flashes from the local newspaper photographer lit up the field. It was a picture-perfect moment. It was everything her parents had ever wanted for her. But as Emily watched her best friend through the roaring crowd, she noticed a single tear slip down Sarah's cheek. It didn't look like a tear of joy. It looked like profound, suffocating sadness. The game resumed, and Fairview eventually won by 2 touchdowns. The town was ecstatic. After the final buzzer, the crowd flooded onto the field to celebrate. The plan for the night was a tradition. Every year after the homecoming game, the senior class threw a massive bonfire party at an abandoned farm on the edge of town, out by the old county line. In the chaotic aftermath of the game, Emily pushed through the crowd to find Sarah near the locker rooms. Sarah was holding her roses, the silver crown resting perfectly on her blonde hair. The wind was whipping around them. "Are you riding with me and Mark?" Emily shouted over the noise of the marching band packing up their instruments. Sarah shook her head. "No, you guys go ahead. I need to take this dress off and change into my jeans. My car is right in the front lot. I'll drive myself. I'll meet you at the bonfire in 20 minutes. Emily nodded. "Okay, don't take too long, it's freezing out here." Sarah stepped forward and hugged Emily. It was a tight, long hug, much longer than usual. She squeezed Emily so hard that it almost hurt. When she finally pulled back, Sarah looked her right in the eyes. "I love you, Em. You know that, right?" "I love you too, weirdo," Emily laughed, shivering in the cold wind. "Hurry up and get to the fire." Sarah turned and walked toward the dimly lit side entrance of the school building, heading for the locker room. Emily watched her go, a beautiful girl in a blue dress, carrying a bouquet of red roses, fading into the shadows of the brick hallway. That was the last time Emily ever saw her best friend. The bonfire at the Miller farm was roaring by 10:30. Cars and pickup trucks were parked haphazardly in the tall grass. The radio was blasting from a truck bed, and dozens of teenagers were standing around the massive fire, laughing, drinking sodas, and celebrating the victory. Emily stood near the edge of the fire with her boyfriend, Mark, keeping one eye on the dirt road leading into the farm. By 11 o'clock, Sarah still hadn't arrived. Emily wasn't panicking yet. She assumed Sarah had been caught up talking to someone at the school, or maybe her car was acting up again. The red Honda Civic was notoriously unreliable in the cold weather. But as the minutes dragged on, a slow, heavy feeling of dread began to pool in Emily's stomach. She walked away from the noisy crowd and found a payphone at a nearby gas station on the highway. She dialed Sarah's pager number, typing in her own number and the code for hurry up. 10 minutes passed, no call back. She paged her again, still nothing. By 11:30, the cold night air felt different. The excitement of the victory had worn off for Emily. She walked back to Mark, grabbing his arm tightly. "We need to go back to the school," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly. "Something isn't right. She should have been here an hour ago." Mark could see the fear in her eyes. He didn't argue. They got into his truck and sped back toward town. The drive felt agonizingly slow. The roads were completely empty. The entire town was either asleep or still at the bonfire. As they approached Fairview High, the massive stadium lights had already been turned off. The building was a massive, dark silhouette against the night sky. Mark turned his truck into the main student parking lot. It was entirely deserted, except for one car. Parked directly under a flickering yellow street lamp was Sarah's red Honda Civic. Emily felt the breath catch in her throat. She pushed the truck door open before Mark had even fully parked, her boots hitting the cold asphalt. She sprinted across the empty lot, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sarah," she yelled out into the darkness. There was no answer. The wind rustled the dry leaves along the chain-link fence, but other than that, the silence was deafening. Emily reached the driver's side of the Honda. She cupped her hands against the cold glass and looked inside. The interior dome light was off, but the street lamp provided just enough light to see. The car was empty. Trembling, Emily reached for the door handle. She pulled it. The door wasn't locked. It clicked open, and the little light inside the car blinked to life. Emily froze, her eyes scanning the front seat. The keys were sitting right there, shoved directly into the ignition. Sarah's everyday canvas purse was resting on the floorboard beneath the steering wheel. Her heavy winter coat, the one she would have desperately needed on a freezing night like this, was draped over the back of the seat. But it was what was sitting on the passenger seat that made Emily's blood run completely cold. Resting perfectly in the center of the gray fabric seat, glinting in the faint yellow light, was the sparkling silver homecoming tiara. Sarah Jenkins had vanished into the cold October night, leaving everything she owned behind. And in a town where everyone knew everyone, nobody saw a thing. Where had she gone? The heavy silence of the empty parking lot pressed down on Emily like a physical weight. The only sound was the rhythmic squeak of a loose chain-link gate blowing in the wind. She stared at the silver tiara sitting perfectly in the center of the passenger seat. It caught the amber light of the street lamp above, sparkling as if mocking her. Mark stepped up behind her, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. He looked over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "She wouldn't leave her keys in the ignition," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "Emily, she loves this car. She wouldn't just leave it running." Emily couldn't speak. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to stuff them into the pockets of her winter coat. The panic was no longer a slow build. It was blinding. "Go to the gas station," Emily managed to say, her voice cracking. "Call the police, call her parents. Do it now, Mark." Mark didn't hesitate. He sprinted back to his truck, the tires screeching on the cold asphalt as he sped toward the highway. Emily stayed by the red Honda Civic. She didn't want to touch anything. She just stood there in the biting wind, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, staring into the dark tree line behind the school. She prayed that any second, Sarah would step out of the shadows, laughing, apologizing for a stupid prank or a misunderstanding. But the shadows remained perfectly still. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a Fairview police cruiser broke through the darkness. The car pulled into the lot, lighting up the brick walls of the high school. A single officer stepped out. It was Officer Davis, a young guy who usually just handed out speeding tickets on the county road. He walked over slowly, shining a heavy black flashlight into the Honda. He didn't look worried, he looked annoyed. "Are you sure she didn't just hitch a ride with somebody else to the bonfire?" Officer Davis asked, scribbling something on a small notepad. "Kids do this all the time. They get excited, leave their stuff, jump in a friend's truck. It's Friday night, Emily." "She wouldn't do this," Emily insisted, tears finally spilling over her cold cheeks. "Her coat is in the car. It's 30 degrees outside. Her purse is right there. The keys are in the ignition. She would never just walk away from her car like this." Officer Davis sighed, clicking his pen closed. "I'll call it in. But realistically, she's 17. She probably got overwhelmed, maybe had a little too much to drink at the game and took off with a boy. Let's give it a few hours before we wake up the whole town." But Emily knew. With a terrifying, absolute certainty, she knew Sarah wasn't at a party. She hadn't run off with a boy. Something terrible had happened. The next morning, the sun rose over Fairview, casting a pale, cold light on a town that was about to wake up to a nightmare. At 7 o'clock, Chief Miller stood on the pristine front porch of the Jenkins residence. He was a veteran cop, a man who had seen a lot of things, but ringing the doorbell of a prominent family to tell them their daughter never came home was never easy. Arthur Jenkins opened the door in his bathrobe, holding the morning paper. His initial reaction wasn't fear. It was anger. He assumed Sarah had stayed out past curfew. He assumed she had embarrassed the family by sleeping over at a friend's house without calling. "Where is she?" Arthur demanded, stepping out onto the porch. "Did you pick her up for drinking? Because if she was drinking, I want her to sit in a cell for a few hours. Teach her a lesson." Chief Miller took his hat off. He looked the man dead in the eye. "Arthur, she's not at the station. Her car was found abandoned at the high school last night. Keys in the ignition, purse inside. We've called every friend in her address book. Nobody has seen her since the football game." The anger drained out of Arthur's face in an instant, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. Behind him, standing in the hallway, Helen Jenkins dropped her ceramic coffee mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending hot coffee splashing across the white baseboards. The sound echoed loudly through the perfect, quiet house. Helen collapsed to her knees, screaming her daughter's name. By noon on Saturday, the entire town of Fairview had mobilized. The news spread through the diner, the hardware store, and over every landline telephone in the county. The homecoming queen was missing. The police taped off the entire student parking lot. They brought in 2 search dogs from the state police division. The dogs started at the red Honda Civic, sniffing the seats, the steering wheel, and the door handles. The handlers led the dogs toward the high school. The dogs traced a clear path from the parking lot, across the frozen grass, and directly to the side door of the building, the door that led to the girls' locker room. Chief Miller and his deputies went inside. The locker room was eerily quiet. The smell of hairspray and floor wax still hung in the air from the night before. They found Sarah's locker right away. Inside, hanging perfectly neat on a plastic hanger, was the shimmering blue homecoming dress. Her cheerleading uniform was folded at the bottom, but her casual clothes, a pair of blue jeans, a white cable-knit sweater, and her white sneakers were missing. "She came in here after the game," Chief Miller told his deputies, looking around the empty room. "She took the dress off, she put her normal clothes on, and then she walked back out to her car." But that was where the trail ended. The tracking dogs followed her scent from the locker room doors, straight to the driver's side of the Honda Civic, and then nothing. The scent completely vanished. It was as if she had reached her car and then evaporated into the thin autumn air. On Sunday morning, a massive search party was organized. Over 300 townspeople showed up at the high school football field, bundled in heavy coats and bright orange hunting vests. Arthur Jenkins stood on the back of a pickup truck, his face pale and sunken. He didn't look like the confident car dealership owner anymore. He looked like a broken man. He begged the town to help him find his little girl. They formed long lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense woods behind the school. They marched through miles of harvested cornfields, their boots crunching on the dry stalks. They poked long sticks into the muddy banks of the creek. They searched abandoned barns, old hunting blinds, and every empty shed within a 5-mile radius. For 12 hours they called her name. "Sarah, Sarah." The voices echoed across the rural landscape, bouncing off the trees and fading into nothing. They found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not a single clue. Late Sunday afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray. A freezing rain began to fall, turning the dirt roads to mud and washing away whatever small traces might have been left behind. The search was officially called off for the night. The townspeople went home cold, wet, and deeply unsettled. The reality was settling in. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a runaway teenager. The investigation quickly stalled. The police interviewed every single person who had been near the locker rooms on Friday night. The band director, the janitor, the assistant football coaches. None of them had seen Sarah after the game ended. The timeline was frustratingly tight. She had told Emily she would be 20 minutes. She walked to the locker room around 10:15. Her car was found abandoned less than an hour later. In a town with no surveillance cameras, no cell phones to track, and no witnesses, the police were entirely blind. A week passed, then two. The local news stations packed up their vans and moved on to other stories. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped to the storefront windows began to fade in the sun. The rain warped the paper, blurring Sarah's beautiful, smiling face into an unrecognizable smudge. The police quietly began pushing the theory that Sarah had run away. It was the only explanation that made sense to them. They argued that she was under massive pressure from her strict parents. They pointed out that there was no sign of a struggle at her car. No blood, no broken glass, no screams heard by anyone. She simply put her keys in the ignition, left her crown on the seat, and got into another vehicle willingly. Arthur Jenkins furiously rejected this. He offered a $50,000 reward for any information leading to her return. He printed thousands of flyers and paid for billboards on the interstate, but the phone lines remained dead. Emily went back to school, but she felt like a ghost. Walking down the hallways without Sarah felt wrong. Sitting at their usual table in the cafeteria was unbearable. Every time a locker slammed shut, Emily flinched, half expecting to see blonde hair and a bright smile. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't accept the police theory. She remembered the look of panic in Sarah's eyes that week. She remembered the strange comment about wanting to disappear. But she also knew Sarah would never have left her car running with her purse inside. It didn't make sense. A month after the disappearance, the police officially cleared the Honda Civic as a crime scene. They had dusted it for fingerprints, vacuumed the floorboards, and found absolutely nothing useful. They released the vehicle back to the Jenkins family. Arthur couldn't bear to look at it. He couldn't stand the sight of the red car parked in his driveway. It was a daily, painful reminder of his missing daughter. One chilly afternoon after school, Emily walked over to the Jenkins house to check on Helen. Helen had barely left her bedroom in a month. She was a shadow of her former self, wearing the same gray sweatpants for days on end, sitting in the dark. Arthur was standing in the kitchen, looking exhausted. He handed Emily a small silver key. "Emily," he said, his voice raspy, "could you do me a favor? Could you move Sarah's car off the street and pull it into the garage? I can't be inside it. I can't do it." Emily nodded silently. She took the key, her fingers cold against the metal. She walked out the front door and down the paved driveway. The red Honda Civic was parked by the curb, covered in a thin layer of autumn frost. Emily unlocked the door and pulled it open. As soon as she sat down in the driver's seat, a wave of grief hit her so hard it knocked the breath out of her lungs. The car still smelled exactly like Sarah, a mixture of cheap vanilla body spray and cherry lip gloss. It was a time capsule of a girl who had ceased to exist. Emily closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. She sat there for a long time, just breathing in the memory of her best friend. Finally, she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the ignition. She reached down with her left foot to press the clutch pedal to start the engine. Her foot hit empty air. Emily frowned. She slid forward on the seat, reaching her leg out further. Her toe barely grazed the rubber pedal. She stopped. A cold chill ran down her spine, freezing her blood. Sarah was 5'2". She was tiny. Whenever she drove, she had to pull the seat all the way forward, pressing her chest almost dangerously close to the steering wheel. Emily was a little taller, 5'3", and even she usually had to keep the seat pulled up. But right now, the driver's seat was pushed completely back on its metal tracks, as far back as it could possibly go. Emily sat frozen. Her eyes slowly moved upward to the rearview mirror. The mirror was angled high up toward the roof of the car. If Emily looked into it, all she could see was the fabric of the backseat ceiling. To use the mirror in this position, the driver would have to be incredibly tall. The police had assumed Sarah walked out of the locker room, got into her car, and vanished. They assumed she left the keys in the ignition herself. But as Emily sat in the oversized space, staring at the pedals she couldn't reach, the terrifying truth settled into her bones. Sarah Jenkins hadn't driven this car to the high school parking lot that night. Someone else did. Emily scrambled out of the driver's seat, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. She didn't bother shutting the car door. She sprinted up the paved driveway and burst through the front door of the Jenkins house. She found Arthur in the kitchen, still staring blankly at his cold coffee. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the front window. She told him about the seat. She explained how it was pushed completely back, how the rearview mirror was angled for someone incredibly tall, and how Sarah could never have reached the pedals. Arthur's eyes widened. For a brief second, a spark of hope, or maybe a spark of terrified realization, flashed across his face. He grabbed the kitchen telephone and immediately dialed the Fairview Police Department. 30 minutes later, Chief Miller pulled up to the house. He walked over to the red Honda Civic, shining his heavy flashlight into the front seat. Emily stood on the freezing sidewalk, wrapping her arms around herself, waiting for him to finally understand, waiting for him to declare the car a crime scene all over again. Instead, Chief Miller simply sighed. The warm air from his breath turned to white smoke in the cold. He closed the car door and walked over to Emily and Arthur. "Arthur, Emily, I know this seems suspicious," Chief Miller said gently, putting a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. "But you have to remember my crime scene technicians tore this car apart 2 weeks ago. They vacuumed the floor mats. They dusted under the seats. One of my deputies, Thomas, is 6'4". He had to slide the seat all the way back just to get under the steering column with his flashlight. They just forgot to push it back up." Emily shook her head, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "But the keys, Chief Miller, the keys were in the ignition. Why would a deputy leave the keys in the ignition after searching it? Chief Miller looked at her with a tired, pitying expression. Emily, it's just a mistake. The car has been processed and cleared. We didn't find any fingerprints that didn't belong to Sarah or her parents. There was no sign of a struggle. I know you're looking for answers. We all are. But this isn't the clue you think it is. He tipped his hat, got back into his cruiser and drove away. Emily stood in the driveway, feeling completely helpless. She knew in her gut that the police were wrong. The forensic team wouldn't have angled the rearview mirror just to vacuum the floor. The car had been driven by someone else. Someone tall. Someone who parked it under the school street lamp, left the keys behind, and walked away into the dark. But without proof, no one was going to listen to a 17-year-old girl. Days bled into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And then, terrifyingly, months turned into years. The seasons changed in Fairview, but the town never truly healed. Sarah Jenkins became a tragic local legend, a ghost story whispered in the high school hallways. The girl who had it all, the beautiful homecoming queen, who simply walked out of her perfect life and vanished into thin air. Graduation came and went. In the spring of 1996, the senior class walked across the football field to receive their diplomas. They left an empty white chair in the front row, a single red rose resting on the plastic seat. Emily cried the entire time. After graduation, Emily packed her bags and left Fairview. She moved to a city hours away, went to college, and tried her hardest to leave the crushing weight of the past behind. She built a life for herself. She got a job, got married, and had children of her own. But every single October, when the leaves started to turn orange and the air grew cold, her mind would drift back to that freezing Friday night. She would see the silver tiara sitting on the empty car seat. 27 years passed. It was the autumn of 2022. Emily was now 44 years old. Her hair had started to turn gray, and the fast-paced life of the city had worn her down. She hadn't been back to Fairview in over a decade. Arthur Jenkins had passed away years ago from a sudden heart attack, his spirit entirely broken by the loss of his daughter. Helen had moved into a care facility, her mind clouded by dementia. Emily only returned to the small town because her own father had passed away, and she needed to clean out her childhood home before selling it. Driving back into Fairview felt like stepping into a time machine. The town looked exactly the same. The same diner, the same hardware store, the same massive stadium lights towering over the high school. It was a place frozen in time. She spent 3 days sorting through decades of accumulated memories. On the 4th afternoon, while digging through a dusty cardboard box in the attic, she found it. Buried under a pile of old spiral notebooks and faded band t-shirts was her high school yearbook. The 1996 Fairview Falcons yearbook. Emily picked it up, running her thumb over the heavy, embossed cover. A thick layer of dust coated the leather. She walked downstairs, sat on the edge of her childhood bed, and turned on the bedside lamp. She slowly opened the book. The very first page was a dedication to Sarah. It featured a beautiful, full-page portrait of her smiling, completely unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Emily traced her finger over her best friend's face. The grief was softer now, dulled by 27 years of time, but it still ached. She began turning the pages, flipping through the memories of a life that felt like it belonged to a completely different person. She saw pictures of the marching band, the math club, the cafeteria. Then she reached page 82. The title across the top of the page read, "Friday Night Lights, a Homecoming to Remember." The yearbook committee had created a 2-page collage of photos from the big game. Because they wanted it to feel personal, they had asked students to submit their own pictures. Dozens of small, square, slightly blurry photos taken with cheap disposable cameras covered the pages. There were pictures of the crowd cheering, the football players covered in mud, and the bonfire blazing in the dark. Emily's eyes scanned over the collage, absorbing the nostalgic images. But as her gaze reached the bottom right corner of the second page, she stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. Tucked into the very corner of the page, surrounded by pictures of the bonfire, was a small, grainy photograph. It was only about 2 inches wide. Emily leaned closer, pulling the heavy book right up to the yellow light of the bedside lamp. Her heart began to pound a familiar, terrified rhythm against her chest. It was a picture of Sarah. Sarah was standing in a brightly lit room, looking directly at the camera, smiling a soft, genuine smile. Her blonde hair was still perfectly styled, curling around her shoulders. Her face was still glowing with the sparkling makeup she had worn for the homecoming court. But it wasn't her makeup that made Emily's blood run cold. It was what she was wearing. In the photograph, Sarah was not wearing the shimmering blue dress. She was wearing a white cable-knit sweater and light blue jeans. The exact same clothes that were missing from her locker. The casual clothes she had changed into after the game ended. And cradled tightly in her arms, held against her chest, was the massive bouquet of dark red homecoming roses. Emily felt the room spin. She put her hand flat on the mattress to steady herself. The police timeline was entirely wrong. They had always believed Sarah went into the locker room, changed her clothes, walked straight to her car, and vanished in the dark parking lot. They thought she had been taken or had run away before ever leaving the school grounds. But this photo proved the impossible. Sarah had successfully changed her clothes. She had taken her roses with her, and she had met up with someone she trusted enough to smile for, someone who pointed a camera at her and took a picture. And they didn't take the picture in the high school parking lot. Emily squinted, pressing her face almost entirely against the glossy paper. She studied the background of the photograph behind Sarah. It wasn't the painted brick of the school hallway. It wasn't the metal lockers. It was dark, stained wood paneling. And directly over Sarah's left shoulder, hanging on the wooden wall, was a very distinct rustic object. It was a taxidermy deer skull with a broken right antler. Emily knew that wall. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead as the memory flooded back to her. Growing up in a small town meant teenagers often spent their weekends driving down dirt roads, looking for places to hang out. 2 miles past the farm where the massive senior bonfire was held, deep in the thickest part of the county woods, was an old, abandoned hunting cabin. It belonged to the Miller family, Chief Miller's family. They had stopped using it years ago, but the local teenagers all knew it was there. It was a place for secret meetings, underage drinking, and escaping the watchful eyes of the town. Sarah had been there that night, after the game. After she changed her clothes, she hadn't left her car at the high school. She had driven to the cabin, or someone had driven her there. But if Sarah was at the cabin, miles away from the school, smiling for a camera, then who drove her red Honda Civic all the way back to the high school parking lot? Who wiped the steering wheel clean, pushed the driver's seat all the way back, left the keys in the ignition, and placed the silver tiara perfectly on the passenger seat to make it look like she vanished there? Someone had staged the entire crime scene. They had purposefully left the car at the school to point the police in the completely wrong direction. They had created a fake mystery to cover their tracks. And worse, whoever took that photograph was the person who did it. Emily looked down at the tiny, grainy picture again. The photo had been submitted to the yearbook committee anonymously. It had been printed without anyone realizing its terrifying significance. For 27 years, the last known photograph of Sarah Jenkins alive had been sitting on the bookshelves of almost every family in Fairview. Emily slammed the yearbook shut. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She grabbed her car keys and ran out the front door into the fading afternoon light. She was going to the old Miller cabin. She was going to find out what really happened on October 20, 1995. The drive to the edge of town felt like a blur. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel of her rental car so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, terrifying rhythm that made it hard to breathe. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the empty county highway. She turned off the paved road and onto the rough, unpaved dirt path that led deep into the woods. The trees grew thick and twisted out here, their bare autumn branches interlocking over the road like a dark, wooden tunnel. The tires crunched loudly over the dry gravel. As she drove deeper into the forest, a sickening realization began to settle over her. She thought about Chief Miller. She thought about his calm, dismissive face when he stood in the Jenkins driveway 27 years ago. He had completely shut down her theory about the car seat being pushed back. He had blamed it on his tall deputy, Thomas. He had told the entire town that Sarah had vanished from the school parking lot. But Chief Miller's family owned the abandoned hunting cabin. Chief Miller had organized the massive search party that Sunday morning. He was the one who drew the maps and assigned the search grids. Emily suddenly remembered walking shoulder to shoulder with the townspeople, freezing in the cold rain. They had searched the cornfields. They had searched the creek. They had searched the barns near the highway. But Chief Miller never sent a single group into these woods. He had intentionally steered hundreds of people away from his own family's property. Emily slammed her foot on the brakes. A massive, rotting oak tree had fallen across the dirt road, blocking the path forward. She threw the car into park and grabbed her phone off the passenger seat to use as a flashlight. She wasn't going to turn back. Not now. Not when she was finally this close. She zipped up her heavy coat and stepped out into the freezing air. The wind howled through the trees, a lonely, haunting sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She climbed over the fallen tree trunk and began walking down the dark path on foot. The woods were terrifyingly quiet. The only sound was the crunch of her own boots on the dead leaves. The temperature was dropping rapidly, just like it had on that Friday night in 1995. Emily tried to imagine what Sarah must have felt if she had walked this same path in the dark. But the photograph in the yearbook showed Sarah smiling. She wasn't afraid. Not at first. Whoever brought her out here was someone she trusted completely. After a grueling 20-minute walk, the trees finally began to clear. Sitting in the center of an overgrown clearing, swallowed by shadows and thick vines, was the Miller hunting cabin. It looked like a rotting wooden skeleton. The roof was partially caved in, and the front porch sagged heavily under the weight of decades of decay. The windows were completely black, staring out into the woods like empty eyes. Emily approached slowly, the beam of her phone flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The wooden stairs groaned violently under her weight as she stepped up onto the porch. A heavy, rusted padlock secured the front door. She wasn't going to let a piece of rusted metal stop her. Emily walked off the porch and searched the overgrown grass until she found a heavy, jagged rock. She carried it back up the steps, raised it above her head, and brought it down hard on the rotting wood frame around the lock. The wood splintered and cracked. She hit it again, and again. On the fourth strike, the dry, brittle doorframe shattered, and the padlock fell to the floorboards with a heavy thud. Emily pushed the heavy wooden door open. The hinges shrieked, a high-pitched metal scream that echoed endlessly into the quiet woods. She stepped inside. The smell hit her instantly. It was the suffocating scent of mildew, dry rot, and decades of stagnant air. The cabin was exactly one large room. The floor was covered in dust and scattered rat droppings. A massive stone fireplace took up the entire left wall. Emily raised her shaking hand, shining the flashlight beam across the room. She swept the light over a rusted iron stove, a rotting wooden table, and a pile of damp, broken chairs. Then the beam of light hit the back wall. Emily stopped breathing. Hanging on the dark, stained wood paneling directly in the center of the wall was the taxidermy deer skull. The right antler was snapped completely in half. It was the exact same background from the tiny photograph in the yearbook. Emily walked slowly toward the wall, her boots leaving fresh tracks in the thick layer of dust. She stopped right in front of the skull and turned around, putting her back to the wood paneling. She stood exactly where Sarah had been standing when the picture was taken. She pointed her flashlight straight ahead, toward the center of the room. "Someone stood right there," Emily whispered into the empty cabin. "Someone stood right there and pointed a camera at you." But if the photo was taken here, why did only one blurry picture end up anonymously submitted to the yearbook committee? The camera must have been a disposable one. Teenagers in the 90s carried them everywhere. If one photo was developed, there had to be others on the same roll of film. And where were Sarah's missing clothes? The killer couldn't have risked driving back into town with a bloody sweater. The risk of getting pulled over was too high. The evidence had to be hidden somewhere. Emily began to search. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy. She flipped over the rotting chairs. She kicked through piles of old newspapers that crumbled into dust. She dragged the heavy, rusted table away from the wall. She shone her flashlight up into the chimney, pulling down handfuls of dead leaves and soot. An hour passed. Her hands were covered in black grime, and her lungs burned from the dusty air. The woods outside were completely pitch black now. The only light for miles was the small white beam from her phone. She stood in the center of the room, feeling a rising wave of despair. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the killer had burned the clothes. Maybe they had thrown everything into the river. But as she shifted her weight, the wooden floorboard beneath her left boot gave a strange, hollow groan. Emily froze. She tapped her boot against the floor. Thud. She stepped back and tapped a different board. Smack, solid wood over dirt. She stepped forward again and struck the original board with her heel. Thud, hollow. The board was located right at the edge of a heavy, cast-iron wood stove that sat in the corner of the room. The floorboards around the stove were dark and stained with old ash. Emily dropped to her knees. She ran her dirty fingers over the edge of the wooden plank. There was a small, intentional gap between this board and the next. It wasn't nailed down securely. It was a false floor. Her heart hammered in her throat as she tried to wedge her fingers into the crack. The wood was swollen from years of humidity and wouldn't budge. She looked around frantically, spotting a rusted iron fire poker lying on the stone hearth. She grabbed the heavy metal tool, wedged the sharp tip into the gap, and pushed down with all of her body weight. The rotting wood shrieked in protest. The rusty nails slowly pulled free with a sickening screech. With one final, violent shove, the floorboard popped upward and snapped in half. Emily tossed the iron poker aside and grabbed her flashlight. She aimed the beam down into the dark, rectangular hole in the floor. It was a small dirt crawlspace, and resting at the bottom, covered in a thick layer of cobwebs, was a dark green canvas duffel bag. Emily let out a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling so violently she almost dropped her phone. She reached down into the cold, damp hole. Her fingers gripped the thick canvas handle of the bag. It was surprisingly heavy. She pulled it up, dragging it out of the hole and onto the dusty floorboards. The bag was old. The metal zipper was heavily corroded with rust. Emily sat back on her heels, staring at the bag. For 27 years she had prayed for answers. She had begged the universe to tell her what happened to her best friend. Now, the answer was sitting right in front of her, and she was absolutely terrified to open it. She took a deep breath, grabbed the zipper, and pulled. The rusted metal fought her, but she yanked it violently until the bag finally tore open. The smell that rose from the bag was horrific. It was the distinct, metallic scent of dried copper and deep decay, preserved inside the thick canvas for nearly 3 decades. Emily pointed the flashlight inside. Lying at the very top of the bag was a white cable-knit sweater. Emily let out a sharp, broken sob, covering her mouth with her free hand. It was Sarah's sweater, but it wasn't white anymore. The entire front of the heavy fabric was stiff, dark brown, and entirely soaked in old, dried blood. There was a massive tear right in the center of the chest. Tucked underneath the bloody sweater were the missing white sneakers, still perfectly laced. And resting beneath the shoes was a thick, brown manila envelope. Emily reached into the bag, her fingers brushing against the stiff, bloody fabric of the sweater. She pulled the heavy envelope out. It was sealed shut with old tape that had turned yellow and brittle. She peeled the tape back. The sound of the paper tearing seemed deafening in the silent cabin. She tipped the envelope upside down. A stack of glossy 4x6 photographs slid out and fell into her lap. Along with the photos fell a small, heavy silver object that hit the wooden floor with a sharp clink. Emily ignored the object for a second, picking up the stack of photographs. Her hands were shaking so hard the edges of the pictures rattled against each other. She brought the flashlight close and looked at the first photo on top of the stack. It was the same picture from the yearbook. Sarah, standing against the wood paneling, holding the red roses, smiling a soft, happy smile. The killer must have developed the film, sent this one innocent photo to the yearbook to mock the town, and hidden the rest. Emily moved the first photo to the back of the stack. She looked at the second picture. The scene had changed. The angle of the camera was different. Sarah wasn't smiling anymore. She was sitting on one of the wooden chairs in the center of the cabin. Her eyes were wide, looking up at the person holding the camera. She looked confused. She looked like she was asking a question. The red roses were resting on the dusty table next to her. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and flipped to the third photo. Pure horror washed over her. In the third picture, Sarah was standing up. Her hands were raised in front of her face in a defensive panic. Her white sweater was clean, but her face was twisted in absolute, undeniable terror. She was looking directly into the camera lens, begging for her life. The flash of the camera illuminated the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh God," Emily whimpered, tears pouring down her own face. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." She didn't want to look at the next photo. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to throw the pictures away and run out of the cabin. But she had to know. She owed it to Sarah. Emily slowly slid the third photo away, revealing the final picture in the stack. The fourth photograph wasn't a picture of Sarah. In the chaos of the moment, a struggle must have occurred. The camera had been dropped. The picture was completely blurry, taken wildly from the floor, pointing upward toward the ceiling of the cabin. But it wasn't completely empty. Caught in the bright, harsh glare of the camera's flash, taking up the entire left side of the photograph, was a distinct, recognizable detail of the killer stepping forward. Emily stopped breathing. She recognized the clothing. She recognized the specific, heavy material. She dropped the photographs. They scattered across the dusty floor. With a trembling, bloodless hand, Emily slowly reached out and picked up the small, heavy silver object that had fallen out of the envelope earlier. She shined her flashlight directly onto it. It was a piece of jewelry, a heavy men's class ring. Emily stared at the engraved letters on the silver band. Her mind raced back 27 years. She thought about the tall person who drove the car. She thought about Chief Miller controlling the search party. She thought about the timeline of that freezing Friday night and who knew exactly where Sarah was going. She looked at the class ring, and then she looked back down at the final blurry photograph on the floor. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. The hidden connections suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Emily dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the wooden floor, the beam casting wild, long shadows against the walls of the cabin. She sat in the dark, surrounded by bloody clothes and 27-year-old photographs, as the devastating, world-shattering truth finally locked into place. She knew exactly who killed Sarah Jenkins. The heavy silver class ring felt like a block of ice in Emily's palm. She wiped her tearing eyes with the back of her dirty sleeve and shined the flashlight directly onto the thick band. The engraved metal was slightly tarnished, but the letters were still perfectly clear. It read, Fairview High, Class of 1991, Thomas Miller. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the ring. It hit the wooden floorboard with a sharp clink, rolling to a stop next to the blurry photograph. She picked up the photo again, her hands shaking violently. She looked closely at the dark, heavy material of the clothing caught in the camera's flash. It wasn't just a thick winter coat. It was the dark navy blue canvas of a police uniform, and resting right on the chest, partially obscured by the blur of movement, was the unmistakable silver glimmer of a Fairview County Sheriff's deputy star. The terrifying puzzle pieces slammed together in Emily's mind, forming a picture so horrifying it made her stomach turn. Thomas Miller, Chief Miller's son. Emily remembered that freezing morning in the Jenkins driveway 27 years ago. She had begged Chief Miller to look at the driver's seat of the red Honda Civic. She had told him it was pushed completely back, proving someone tall had driven Sarah's car. And Chief Miller had calmly looked her in the eye and lied. One of my deputies, Thomas, is 6'4". He had to slide the seat all the way back just to get under the steering column. They just forgot to push it back up. Chief Miller had used his own son's height to explain away the most crucial piece of evidence in the entire investigation. And it wasn't just a coincidence. Chief Miller had drawn the maps for the massive search party. He had deliberately steered hundreds of volunteers into the freezing rain, sending them through miles of empty cornfields and muddy creek beds. He made sure that absolutely no one walked anywhere near his family's abandoned hunting cabin in the deep woods. He had covered up a murder to protect his son. Emily sat in the dark, surrounded by the bloody evidence, as the reality of that Friday night finally became clear. Sarah hadn't run away. She hadn't met a stranger in the dark. When she walked out of the girls' locker room holding her roses, she had run into Deputy Thomas Miller. He was a young cop, a trusted figure in the community. He must have told her there was an issue at the bonfire or that he needed to speak with her privately. Because he wore a badge, she trusted him. She got into her car and he followed her out to this cabin. He had locked her inside. He had taken those twisted, terrifying photographs. And when she realized she was in danger when she fought back, he had killed her. Then, to hide his tracks, Thomas put on her white sweater to absorb the blood, or hid the clothes to destroy the evidence later. He drove her red Honda Civic all the way back to the high school parking lot. He pushed the seat back because of his tall frame. He left the keys in the ignition and carefully placed the silver tiara on the passenger seat to make it look like a random kidnapping. It was the perfect crime, orchestrated by a predator and protected by the very man who was sworn to keep the town safe. A sudden, terrifying thought pierced through Emily's grief. Thomas Miller was still alive. After his father retired, Thomas had stayed on the force. He was now the chief of police in Fairview. The man who brutally murdered her best friend was sitting in an office less than 5 miles away, wearing a badge, fully believing he had gotten away with it. Emily didn't hesitate. Survival instinct took over. She frantically gathered the terrible photographs. She shoved them back into the brown manila envelope, along with the heavy silver class ring. She grabbed the bloody, stiff white sweater and the white sneakers, shoving everything back into the dark green canvas duffel bag. She zipped the rusted zipper as far as it would go. She grabbed her phone and the heavy iron fire poker, standing up on shaking legs. She didn't look back at the dark crawlspace. She ran out of the cabin, her boots thudding loudly against the rotting porch stairs. The woods were pitch black now. The wind whipped through the bare branches, sounding like distant, mocking laughter. Emily ran down the dirt path as fast as she could, dragging the heavy canvas bag beside her. The beam of her phone flashlight bounced wildly against the trees. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep behind her. Every shadow looked like a tall man in a police uniform. She reached her rental car, throwing the bag into the passenger seat and slamming the door. She locked the doors instantly, her fingers fumbling as she jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. She threw the car in reverse, backing up recklessly until she cleared the fallen oak tree, and then slammed her foot on the gas. She didn't drive toward the town of Fairview. She knew that if she went to the local police station, Thomas Miller would destroy the evidence and she would quietly disappear just like Sarah did. Instead, Emily merged onto the interstate and drove 80 miles an hour toward the city. She drove straight to the state police headquarters. It was nearly midnight when she burst through the glass doors of the state precinct. The front desk sergeant looked up, startled by the panicked, dirty woman dragging a filthy canvas bag across the linoleum floor. Emily slammed the bag onto the front counter. She was shaking so hard she could barely breathe. "I have evidence," Emily gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I have evidence of a murder. The Fairview chief of police killed my best friend 27 years ago, and I can prove it." The sergeant's expression shifted from annoyance to extreme caution. He called for a detective. For the next 4 hours, Emily sat in a brightly lit interview room. She watched as state investigators carefully opened the green duffel bag. She watched the color drain from their faces as they examined the bloody sweater. She watched the lead detective hold up the silver class ring with a pair of tweezers. And then, she watched them line up the 4 photographs on the metal table. There was no denying it. The pictures told a story of pure horror. By dawn, the state police had mobilized a massive tactical unit. They didn't call the Fairview Police Department to warn them. They descended on the small town in a fleet of unmarked black SUVs. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet suburban streets, breaking the 27-year silence that had suffocated the town. Emily sat in the back of an unmarked cruiser, watching from a distance as a team of heavily armed state troopers kicked down the front door of Thomas Miller's beautiful, 2-story home. 10 minutes later, they dragged him out in handcuffs. Thomas Miller was 51 years old now. His hair was gray, and he looked nothing like the young, imposing deputy in the photograph. As the state troopers pushed him toward the transport van, he looked confused, angry, and indignant. He yelled about his rights. He demanded to know who authorized a raid on a fellow officer. Then the lead state detective walked up to him. He held up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was the silver class ring and the terrifying photograph of Sarah begging for her life. Thomas Miller stopped yelling. The color completely vanished from his face. His knees buckled and he stared at the plastic bag like he was looking at a ghost. In that single, fleeting moment, the confident, untouchable chief of police completely shattered. He knew it was over. The arrest of Thomas Miller sent shockwaves through the entire state. The story made national headlines within hours. The media descended on Fairview, setting up news vans outside the high school and the police station. The investigation moved swiftly. The forensic team processed the abandoned cabin, finding Sarah's dried blood soaked deep into the wooden floorboards under the false floor. The DNA matched perfectly. Faced with undeniable, overwhelming physical evidence and the threat of the death penalty, Thomas Miller finally broke. He confessed to everything. He admitted that he had been obsessed with Sarah for months. He admitted that he had stopped her in the parking lot that night, convincing her that a group of teenagers had been arrested at the Miller farm, and he needed her to come identify them. He admitted that his father, the former Chief Miller, had suspected him the next morning. His father had found the bloody clothes, hidden them under the floorboards, and spent the rest of his life protecting his monster of a son. But the most important thing Thomas Miller surrendered was the location of Sarah's body. 3 days later, on a cold, overcast Tuesday morning, a state forensic excavation team dug up a small patch of earth behind an old tractor shed on the original Miller family farm. Deep in the cold Ohio dirt, they found her. After 27 years of being lost in the dark, Sarah Jenkins was finally brought back to the light. The town of Fairview shut down completely on the day of Sarah's funeral. It wasn't just a high school tragedy anymore. It was a deep, communal wound that had finally been lanced open. Every store on Main Street flipped its sign to closed. The diner locked its doors. The church was filled beyond capacity. Hundreds of people stood outside in the freezing autumn air, listening to the service through open doors. Arthur Jenkins was gone. Helen Jenkins was completely lost to dementia, unaware that her daughter had finally been found. So it was Emily who sat in the front row. She looked at the beautiful, closed mahogany casket resting at the front of the church. It was draped in a blanket of deep red roses, identical to the ones Sarah had held on the night she disappeared. When it was time to speak, Emily slowly walked up the carpeted steps to the wooden podium. She looked out at the crowded room. She saw the faces of her former classmates, now middle-aged, their eyes red and swollen with tears. "For 27 years we were told a lie," Emily's voice echoed through the quiet church, trembling but fiercely strong. "We were told that Sarah walked away from us. We were told that she didn't love us enough to stay. But the truth is, she never wanted to leave. She was taken from us by someone who hid behind a badge and protected by a man who was supposed to seek justice." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, gripping the edges of the podium. But the dark cannot hide the truth forever. No matter how deep you bury it, no matter how many lies you tell, the truth will always wait patiently in the shadows. It waited 27 years for Sarah, and now she can finally rest. Emily stepped down from the podium. She walked over to the casket, gently placing her hand on the polished wood. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The suffocating weight of the mystery was finally gone. Thomas Miller pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom. He would die in a concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the town he had once sworn to protect. The name Miller was erased from Fairview. The town tore down the old hunting cabin. They bulldozed the land where Sarah had been found, planting a beautiful memorial garden in its place. Emily eventually returned to her life in the city, back to her husband and her children. The memories of Fairview would always be tinted with tragedy, but the paralyzing grip of the past was finally broken. There is a saying that time heals all wounds, but that isn't entirely true. Time just covers them up. Time lets the dust settle over the broken floorboards and lets the leaves cover the dirt roads. It doesn't take time to heal a wound. It takes the truth. It takes someone who is willing to look into the dark, refuse the easy answers, and fight for the people who can no longer fight for themselves. Sarah Jenkins was the homecoming queen of Fairview High. She was beautiful, she was kind, and she was loved. And because of a best friend who simply refused to let her be forgotten, her story finally had an ending.